So the idea for the research came out of my PhD, which looked at accountability in public sector supply chains. And as we developed the idea, because it's now been almost 2 years since the end of the PhD, looking for a theoretical hook that would actually work, which was quite tough. We kind of reflected on why we'd done the research, what the main strands of the research were. One of the big issues is that a lot of my research is on human rights and modern slavery, and pretty much all of the regulation and legislation that looks at dealing with modern slavery works by using market mechanisms. So the UK Modern Slavery Act was designed in a way that there's no strict punishment for non-compliance, and there's no real incentive within the legislation to go beyond the basics, but the expectation was that organisations would go beyond the basics because there would be this race to the top, this desire of organisations to prove to stakeholders that they were taking the issue seriously and were doing the work in their supply chains to manage the risks. And that hasn't happened. But no one's really looked at the public sector yet, because the public sector has this kind of care for stakeholders built into its reason for existing, and it buys vast quantities of goods and services every year. So just UK higher education spends over £2 billion in the UK through purchasing consortia, and that was another angle that made the public sector very interesting. Public sector organisations don't buy their goods and services strictly as individual organisations. Quite a lot of their purchasing is done through these intermediaries, and those consortia negotiate better prices for the public sector and increasingly negotiate minimum sustainability terms on issues like the environment and modern slavery. And if the regulatory aspect wasn't working because of the market logic within that, we wondered if the public sector could do a better job, because it's, although it is to some extent still tied to the market logic, it's less tied to the market logic. And so eventually we came to look at these purchasing consortia in the way that we probably should have looked at them from the start, as meta-organisations, or organisations which consist of other organisations. And we discovered that not only is there very little literature on this, but helpfully there is a theory on this. And so when we went to look at some of the management literature and a book that kicked off the theory 20-ish years ago, there were some helpful tips there, and that these organisations are extremely prevalent. So when the authors, Anna and Brunson, published the book in 2008, there were 7,000 meta-organisations just in Sweden. And we know these organisations without knowing, or without calling them meta-organisations, because we know what industry bodies are. There's a little bit of confusion between what a meta-organisation is and a multi-stakeholder initiative, but hopefully we've teased out some of that so that other authors, other scholars can build on that in their research. So the research, because there's effectively no meta-organisations research in the operations and supply chain space yet, and because very little is known about how meta-organisations operate empirically, despite there being some conceptualisation of what they do, we wanted to undertake a case study to find out how this actually worked. And I have connections in UK higher education purchasing consortia, and so I approached them, and I approached 6 of the other 7 meta-organisations in public sector purchasing. One of them, the one that we didn't approach, deals solely with energy, which has supply chains that may need investigating, but would have made a comparative study quite difficult, because we're dealing with consortia that buy or that negotiate deals for electronics and food and clothing, and just not comparable. So we approached 7 of the 8. 2 agreed to take part and gave us the kind of access we'd need to develop, the kind of rich data that you need to theorize around these issues. And so the paper is a comparative case study of 2 purchasing consortia in UK higher education. One of the consortia also represents a wide range of other public sector organisations and is therefore bigger in scope, but they're both reasonably similar in terms of size by the scale of purchasing that's done through them and by the number of employees they have. So it was useful in that respect that they were similar, because then we can look at how they operate and the results they get and map how they operate to those results and to be able to compare those. And we were very aware that this market-based logic was still a big issue for organizations in this space. So we used institutional logics as a lens to look at the issue. And so because we believed that these purchasing consortium would have a better chance of not being so market oriented and pay a little bit more attention to the social issue that we were looking at of modern slavery, we looked at the hybridization of logics. And so the research question is, how do public sector purchasing consortia navigate the conflicting logics of the market logic and an anti-slavery logic, which we see emerging in the literature? The broad finding is that these meta-organisations are able to some extent to hybridise the market and the anti-slavery logic, which is a very interesting finding. I think means that the potential for further study here is substantial, not only because there are multiple other meta-organisations in the UK that do the same thing, but also several European countries operate similar systems, and it will be interesting to see how things work there. That the return that members get on the money they pay to be members of these meta-organisations is substantial. So one of them, in terms of the money that members pay as a ratio to the savings that they make buying through these agreements, is 75 to 1 and above. So it makes commercial sense as well as making sense in terms of work against modern slavery. And I think that's one of the really big findings, is that for private organisations this might still be a struggle. We can see in the literature over 20-30 years that there are claims that consumers will pay more for more responsible goods, either environmentally or socially, but actually when it comes down to it, that's an idea that consumers like. And I don't think that's any different in B2B or B2G, business government either. Organisations want to buy from more responsible companies, but they don't necessarily have the resources to do so if there's a cost attributable to responsible purchasing. And so what we find is that the scale of public purchasing is able to drive prices down sufficiently and demand better purchasing practices in terms of sustainability, that to some extent you can have both. And now that's the really good news. There's that is limited both by the extent to which sustainability in general and modern slavery in particular is part of public sector purchasing. So the way that public sector purchasing works is that bids are made for a contract, and those bids are evaluated based on a weighting system where the commercial aspect usually gets 70 to 80%. Sustainability might get 20, of which modern slavery and the environment together may get 10. And so there's a limit in terms of the extent to which modern slavery can be pushed in these contracts. there's also a limitation in terms of these meta-organisations, these consortia, not having the expertise necessarily to go further. So while they can demand better behaviour from suppliers in supply chains and demand evidence of that, either themselves or partnering with other organisations, they aren't necessarily able to go out and conduct audits or do worker voice projects where they really seek to understand what's going on upstream in these supply chains. There was one of our consortia, one of our case organisations did that, and some of its members were very happy that these checks had been conducted and expected that that was the kind of work that should be done. But similarly, some members also thought that that was beyond the scope of the consortium, that it didn't have the expertise, and that with what we know about how problematic social audits are, it may not have been beneficial at all anyway. I think one thing we found that really confirms a lot of the prior literature outside of sustainable supply chain management in the management literature is that what you really need to drive change is you need leadership that's on board. And one of our case organisations have had successive managing directors who are very focused on this. They have their own responsible procurement manager, and everyone else in the organisation sees it to some extent as their responsibility in the contracts that they look after to be looking after the modern slavery work, the environmental work, etc. The other consortium that we looked at had appointed a sustainability manager at the beginning of COVID, but that person retired during COVID and had not been replaced, and so the drive from top management wasn't there, and however motivated individual staff might be, without the prioritization from the top, that again proved very difficult. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. I think whether you look at the private or the public sector, when you come across companies that are driven by that kind of responsibility, it usually comes from the top. I guess it was a little bit disappointing that in the public sector that's not more of a consideration, but the public sector now more than ever is probably under financial constraints that mean that savings to be made anywhere have to be made, and if that's the case in the wider public sector, then in UK academia at the moment that is doubly so. Where money can be saved, it should be saved, and I think the consortium that continues to do a lot of work on modern slavery not only should be applauded for that work, but also with the financial return that's available, it's almost a no-brainer that you would invest a little bit more to ensure that you are managing those risks better. I think finally on findings, the consortium that was doing the most work was to a certain extent still focused on the fact that some of its members weren't fully compliant with the Modern Slavery Act and still needed some help and updates. And I think that 5 or 6, 7 years after the Modern Slavery Act was enacted, when we finalised data collection for this project, I would expect, and I don't think it's unreasonable to expect, organisations with turnovers of £100 million a year and more to be self-sufficient in doing that work. Complying with the Modern Slavery Act doesn't take an awful lot of effort, and if organisations in higher education were doing that for themselves, then the consortia would be able to use the resources that they had to be doing more of that outreach, partnering with organisations in the supply chain, and maybe not doing the audit work itself, but finding out which of its supply chains were already audited and using that as a selling point for members to demonstrate that in X, Y and Z supply chains, we can't say for certain that these risks don't exist, but these risks have been checked and are therefore minimised in comparison to some of your other supply chains. So I've touched a little bit on implications. I think the implication that I just mentioned is that higher education institutions could be spending a little bit more money for a lot more leverage in the supply chains where they have risks. Modern slavery doesn't necessarily get you on the front page of a newspaper for good reasons, but occasionally it does get you on the front page of newspapers for the wrong reasons. And I think eventually we might end up with a public sector body or even a university on the front page for having done an insufficient amount of work on this. And so that really should be on the risk radar of higher education institutions. I think that's one of the implications. I think a much broader implication is that meta-organisations as a tool for delivering sustainability, despite being very much under-investigated and under-theorised in the supply chain literature, have enormous potential. As different as the public sector contexts might seem, I think there are differences. I think there are substantial overlaps, both in terms of the value for money that these organisations want, and they'll call that different things, but it basically comes down to value for money or efficiency. And what they need from sustainability, I think they can both be addressed, and there's enormous scope for future research there in terms of both public sector organisations, meta-organisations, and private sector meta-organisations, and the links between the two. So one of the meta-organisations that we dealt with assures electronics supply chains by using an organisation called Electronics Watch. So when a UK university buys electronics through one of these frameworks negotiated by a consortium, Electronics Watch can be given the information on where the electronics were manufactured and go and check that manufacturing plant itself, or in most cases partner with an organisation in the country that the manufacturing plant is based and have a check or have checks conducted, including using worker voice and kind of cutting edge ways of managing those risks. And so I think there are links between public and private sectors as well that come out here that are interesting implications. I think that managing modern slavery in a different way, or just the desire to manage it more actively, is an implication here. Private sector organisations are going to be under similar, in some ways, restrictions in terms of what they are either able or willing to spend on this, but that sharing of information that happens through a meta-organisation, the raising of awareness, and to some extent hybridising these logics, I think are big implications. And so I think that, as you're right to say, that there are lots of different areas of findings here, and I think there is an implication or implications in each different area of these findings. In terms of future research, I think there's abundant areas of future research here. I think meta-organisations as a focus for research, with the scale and the scope of them, everything from business associations which lobby on behalf of industries, all the way through to these sustainability focused ones like International Council on Metals and Mining, the Responsible Minerals Initiative in the mining industry. They've been around for decades, and somehow scholars have mentioned them occasionally in research and not really focused on them at all, despite their public nature and the scale and the scope of what they do in industries where there's a real need for this. So I think there's one area of future research. And within those meta-organisations, I think there are some, because they've been so under-theorised so far, some of the theory is quite immature, and in 5 years' time, I hope that people look at this work that we're talking about now, our paper, in exactly the same way. This is a very early paper on what, in terms of the academic literature, on what meta-organisations are and do and how they do those things. And it'd be quite disappointing if we're not looking at this paper as an immature paper in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. So I think how they operate and how they're governed, to some extent, remains a mystery. I think, and the implications for how they're governed are huge. If they are standalone entities that set their own goals and have minimal input from members in the same way that the two meta-organisations in our case do, what does that mean for sustainability when some of them are very driven by sustainability and some of them may not be so driven, as evidenced by the two cases in our paper? What would really intensive internal lobbying by members and direction by members look like, and what happens when members or groups of members have completely different ideas about future direction or how to achieve these goals, or even if these goals should be the focus of a meta-organisation? So I think there's lots to unpick in terms of how meta-organisations operate and what the implications are there. There's a huge amount still to do on the public sector in terms of sustainability broadly and modern slavery in particular. I know modern slavery as a framing has tended to be a very Anglo-centric way of looking at this. So the UK and Canada and Australia and New Zealand tend to talk about modern slavery as modern slavery, whereas in Europe there's more of a more holistic view of these issues as human rights issues. What does public sector procurement look like in Europe, and how does it address these risks, especially as more and more legislation is built up around long-standing understandings of human rights and how they should be addressed and how they should be protected? And I think the modern slavery literature so far has been very top-down. I think I thought of this recently, that there's an irony in the modern slavery literature that we, and I'm as much to blame as anyone else for this, we conceptualize modern slavery in a way, or businesses conceptualize modern slavery in a way that we recognize as managerialization. There's no involvement of workers, or very little involvement of workers. And there's been some great work, including in Journal of Supply Chain Management by Joe Meehan and Bruce Pennington on this, for example, of how these issues are framed almost to suit the company that is supposed to be doing the reporting, as opposed to managing the risk to vulnerable individuals. But in doing that, we also fail to include workers in our research, and so we've managerialized or academized, to make up a word on the spot, this managerialization of what we're seeing. And I think that there is just a huge space in myriad settings and contexts to involve, or to use that bottom-up approach and make the research that we do genuinely impactful. So those are the kind of the three big future research areas. Immediately after we finished writing the first draft of this paper, I won some money from the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre, and we've finished that project, which works with another UK public sector consortium and is a field level study. So for that we interviewed managers at the consortium and members and suppliers and tier 2 suppliers and charities in this space, and some of the data management platforms that help the public sector manage the vast amounts of data that there are in the system. So that's one area of future research that we're looking at, and building from there in terms of what do consortia look like elsewhere, and what are the implications for different types of meta-organisation or different methods of operating for meta-organisations. Other than that, this bottom-up approach, I think, is long overdue. There are other literatures, there are other disciplines especially once we leave the nice cosy confines of business schools, who are quite happy to go out into the field and talk to workers. That's a slightly unfair characterization. There are some business school researchers who go out into the field and talk to workers. And if it sounds like I'm blaming anyone, I'm blaming myself as much as anyone else. But I think that theorizing an entire discipline while ignoring most of the people that are affected by the practices that we theorize strikes me as slightly strange, and so that's one area that I'd really like to address. And also there are issues around modern slavery and human rights, such as how they're conceptualized and what work is done, that when you look at the literature currently, they are mentioned in the same way that meta-organizations have been mentioned. So human rights is mentioned multiple times in the supply chain literature, as you'd expect, but there hasn't really been an investigation of what they mean for organizations, what they mean for supply chains, what the work is. There are assumptions that stick out when you start searching for human rights in our discipline, and really diving deeply into where those assumptions come from and what the reality is behind them is something that we've started to look at as well.